So today we're going to take a look at a module titled Evaluating Labor Market Models. And in this module, we'll briefly take a look at models as they define the market. We'll take a look at equations that define the model, or the market, of course. We'll take a look at how we might interpret a labor market model. We'll then take a look at a system of two equations that will give us some understanding or illustration of the model itself and its dynamic forces. And then briefly we'll take a look at some labor market friction. So let's begin this by taking a look at models as they define the market. And in this we're going to consider how these models are formed as part of a Cartesian coordinate XY space. We'll look at demand curves or some graphic relationship showing labor demand, supply curves or some graphic relationship showing labor supply. We'll then take a brief look at what equilibrium means. We'll take a look at intercepts in that, and then we'll think about friction and disequilibrium in a very simplistic way. But let's begin by thinking about this issue of this coordinate. Well, we know that by and large we see positive space in most economic graphics, where we have some y-axis and we have some x-axis, and that makes good sense to us, of course, but it's not the only thing that makes sense. We're going to suppose then that if this is a Cartesian coordinate in x and y space, that Cartesian coordinate actually extends on like this, such that we have some positive space, some negative space, some negative positive space, and then possibly some positive negative space. So all of these are active, but we focus primarily in economics on the positive space, but not exclusively, and that'll make a little bit more sense to us here in a moment. So let me get rid of these extra marks so they don't confuse us more than is necessary. And then we'll move on and talk about the formation of these curves and the other items that I've identified for us here. But I'm going to leave these markers here so we can think about the negative space elements. So let's come back to thinking about what really is taking place here in this labor market model, where we have on the y-axis some price, or in labor, the price of labor is wage. And on the x-axis, we have some units, or we call those L for labor in the labor market. Well, we know that in this market there is some negative relationship or negatively sloped line that could represent a labor demand. So let's just give ourselves a negative sloped line here. We'll make it very linear, very simple, and we'll say that this is the labor demand curve. And this would suggest that as the wage rises, the number of workers required falls. So something along this line. If we have a wage here, then it tells us we have number of workers here. So we're going to call this W prime and L prime. But if the wage falls to W naught, then the labor demanded at this lower wage would be L naught. So as wage rises, labor units fall, and vice versa. So that would be our demand relationship. That makes sense to us. So let me go ahead and get rid of some of that as we talk a little further about these, again, just so that we don't confuse ourselves with these extra markings we have here. And think about the labor supply relationship. Well, labor supply is actually going to be upward sloping, such that as wage rises, the number of workers prepared to work will increase. So we'll look at it at first something like this. I don't like that, so let's get rid of that and try it again. So it's going to look something along this line, and we'll call that labor supply. But admittedly, labor supply doesn't necessarily cross the y-axis. It's just as feasible to think about a labor supply that crossed the x-axis and then went ahead and crossed the y-axis in negative space. That's a possible labor supply curve as well, but I want to focus on this one in positive space. Let me get rid of this other one. So the negative relationship here is going to suggest that as firms might want to hire more workers, that each worker might be worth less to them in a wage And that might come back to the issue of marginal product of labor, marginal revenue product of labor that's discussed extensively in one of the other modules. So labor demand is downward or negatively sloped. You'll see this in the equation later also, because the marginal product of labor and marginal revenue product of labor declines as the labor units rise, which means if those revenues and those products decline, then what we can afford to pay for them similarly declines. Labor supply, on the other hand, being upward sloped, this would suggest to us that since it's a household or worker supplying this, in order to motivate the household or worker to supply greater quantity of labor, they must be paid a higher wage. Now, there can be many reasons for this, but we think that this has more to do with the trade-off between labor and leisure than it does anything else. Again, this will be talked about more extensively in another module. So let's deal with this issue of equilibrium for a moment. Equilibrium is when we experience this point in the labor model where supply and demand are the same value. So labor supply is equal to labor demand in terms of the value of L at that point, such that at some wage, which we're going to call W star, labor supply and labor demand are the same value, and we're going to call that value L star, which simply is the equilibrium value, so the market has equal labor supply and demand at that wage, or it's the market clearing value, which suggests to us that all the labor that wants to supply itself at that wage is consumed by all the firms that demand labor at that wage, such that there's no surplus or shortage left in the market. Well, as it turns out, we're going to be able to have some equations that help us define all of this, but this is just looking at a very basic form. So let's also think about the value or the interpretation, perhaps, of these intercepts here. And we'll go into more detail on this in a few minutes or in another segment, but just know that as the curves cross these axes, it tells us something. We need to be thinking about what that's communicating to us. So there'd be some number of workers that are demanded at a zero wage, but no workers demanded at a high wage. Similarly, there is some level of workers that present themselves at a wage above this level, which we are going to think of as we interpret this a little later as a reservation wage. We can also think about briefly then friction and disequilibrium in this market, and all that means is some exogenous influence, so external exogenous influence comes into the market, upsets this equilibrium. It's like a little bit of sand has come into this otherwise well-oiled piece of machinery and causes some disequilibrium, so such that the equilibrium value no longer has its place. Let's assume for a moment that we had some value of labor or wage that was imposed on the market up above W star. We'll talk later on about what that might be. That creates then a mismatch or a disequilibrium friction between labor demand and labor supply, such that at this wage, I'm going to call it wage M, which might mean a minimum wage, and such that at that value of wage, the number of firms that demand workers is low, the number of workers looking for or willing to work is high, such that demand is less than supply. There ends up being a surplus, and we call that surplus unemployment.